Mask all, mask all. Very Eastern transcendental in orientation, don't you think? In the last segment, we took a little detour all the way across the state line to Tennessee with Cluck and Keeling at WJHL Channel 11, covering news in the Tri-City area, who, with their heads that apparently don't know the difference between vest and invest, put their heads together on a story idea on Ralph Northam's facial coverings mandate and decided to do some research of their own by calling the director of a major gifts department at a law school in the bottom 25% of best law schools to ask him for an expert opinion. They dialed up the phone, had someone on the line say, "Duncan School of Law, major gift, how can I help you?" And they get this opinion about Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a case about the smallpox vaccines at a time when absolutely nobody was talking about vaccines, and where Stuart Harris, their expert, says the Supreme Court basically said the state has the power effectively to strap you down and stick a needle in your arm and make you get vaccinated, which it actually doesn't say. But again, if they wanted an expert opinion, the Cluck and Keeling team probably would not have called the donor line for major gifts at a law school in the bottom 25%. I don't know, common sense. But almost a quarter century ago, Blake Morant, now affiliated with the George Washington University Law School, which most have heard of, was fresh from active duty in the JAG Corps, which most have heard of, and spreading his little wings as a law professor down at Washington and Lee University School of Law, a Tier 1 law school. And if you haven't heard of it, you probably can't afford it. And even though it was a class that absolutely nobody, and I do mean nobody, at a Tier 1 law school wanted to take, not even I, nor had any interest in taking, because when you're selected at the best of the best in academics and pay thousands of dollars to attend a top law school, you expect a good return on your investment. And that expectation generally is a whole lot higher than a sinecure as a bureaucrat in a secure government job, which may well be the pinnacle of achievement with highest aspiration for students at other law schools of lesser distinction. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that. But Blake actually told us that at the end of the class, we would know everything, absolutely everything we needed to know about administrative law, and exactly how much more than a semester-long course with Blake might one expect to meet the work order specification of good enough for government damn work. And this is important because Blake offered a promise of performance tendered in consideration for completing his class, and there was no breach of contract therein. I felt completely satisfied with what I got. And at no time during that class did we ever discuss Jacobson v. Massachusetts at all, which made the very mention of the case suspect, at least to me, even for the aspect of reaching public health and police powers of the state, because just like Blake Morant told us, that if we wanted to have a successful career in administrative law, the only thing that we had to do was to roll into court and scream, "Due process, due process." There was only one big case that we needed to know if we ever had to deal with a regulatory agency of any kind. Chevron USA v. NRDC, a 1984 case decided by the United States Supreme Court. It's a doctrine of regulatory deference case that spells out the quick and dirty rule on how to win or lose in a courtroom when you deal with a regulatory agency, and you don't need to know anything more to succeed or fail in that government work. I quote, if this choice of a regulatory agency represents a reasonable accommodation of conflicting policies that were committed to the agency's care by the statute, we should not disturb it unless it appears from the statute or its legislative history that the accommodation is not one that Congress would have sanctioned, unquote. This is simply a restatement of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, but updated to include the emergence of big government expert regulatory agencies, So under Chevron, the only thing that you have to do is to demonstrate that the government experts were clearly erroneous, absolutely positively wrong, with no option for debate, which under most circumstances is probably going to present a formidable challenge. But for a decision a decade ago in the Obama administration at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, this may have been a rather hard case to bring. But it was not. A decade ago, NIOSH wrote the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC recommends the use of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, approved respirators for reducing exposure to infectious aerosols such as those that cause severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and novel influenza H1N1. The use of large number of respirators created a demand during the spread of SARS in the USA. Recently, CDC predicted that the need for disposable N95 respirators could exceed 90 million for the protection of healthcare workers for an outbreak of 42 days of influenza A H5N1, indicating a possible shortage of respirators. Accordingly, recognizing the problem of potential shortage of medical-grade N95 respirators, they stated one of the recommendations was to conduct research on the effectiveness of woven cloth masks for the transmission of influenza virus, because cloth masks may be the only option available for some individuals during a pandemic. Just 10 years ago, planning a pandemic. Research on alternative respiratory protective materials, including common fabric materials such as t-shirts, handkerchiefs, and scarves, was also recommended. In the absence of respirators, some individuals may use improvised common fabric materials for respiratory protection while entering a contaminated environment, such as when caring for an infected family member at home. These household materials are not designed for respiratory protection, and their use may provide a false sense of protection because their effectiveness against larger and 1,000 nanomicron sized particles, including viruses, is not well understood. So here we have the NIOSH first recognizing a potential problem involving a potential shortage of medical-grade N95 disposable respirators in a pandemic, 10 years before we had one, developing a list of potential non-medical grade cloth substitutes, and acknowledging not only that these substitutes are not designed to perform the job of medical grade protection, but also that normal folks who are not experts may have some misguided ideas and notions about how protection in a respiratory tract infection goes in their head. And in validation of that very thought, in August 2020, the CDC actually had to retain a cartoonist to explain to non-experts where the location of their nose and mouth were, so as to wear the non-medical grade facial coverings properly. Now, NIOSH spared no expense on this study 10 years ago, and to test for what is described as polydispersed aerosol penetration. If you don't understand it, don't worry, you're not a damn expert. They used a TSI 8130 automated filter tester, which is the gold standard for testing, and that is used to rate the N95 disposable respirators at other medical grade protection. And to test monodispersed aerosol penetration, they use the TSI 3160 fractional efficiency tester, which is also the gold standard diagnostic equipment for that purpose, with some tested medium failing to block nanoparticles as much as 90% of the time. They concluded that results obtained in the study show that common fabrics may provide only marginal protection against nanoparticles, including those in the size ranges of virus-containing particles in exhaled breath. And if those results were a green light for non-medical grade substitutes, there would be no evolving science during the pandemic for facial coverings, would there? Someone would just have said that NIOSH says these work, and that is it. But did that occur? No, it did not. Applying the Chevron rules, just like Blake Morant taught his students in the comprehensive course on everything you ever wanted to know about administrative law and did not know to ask, and more. Almost a quarter century ago, the common sense test to determine whether it appears from the statute or its legislative history that the accommodation is not one that Congress would have sanctioned is this: If your car fails the damn car inspection, do you go out and invent another damn passport that it can pass? No, you do not. You do not, especially not in a public health crisis where people are dying, unless you're an idiot. Now, another case becomes important here, and it is one that at least everyone in Northern Virginia knows, because Ralph Northam went to Fairfax County and led 2 rounds of applause when the decision was announced in what he called the DACA case, DHS v. Board of Regents for the University of California, decided last summer, and which had quoted for its rule Michigan v. EPA. So all of our, environmentalists should love this stuff, all this crap, because it's all environmental crap. A 2015 case that had been decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. Judicial review of agency action is limited to the grounds of the agency that the agency invoked when it took the action, or what was known at the time. And since there has been a lot of talk about evolving science, it is important to note that under U.S. v. Clemco, one of the factors for weighing circumstantial evidence to establish a prima facie case for charging persons for participation in criminal conspiracy is what are described as false exculpatory statements. And evolving science is an abnegation, or shall we say derogation, of the rule articulated by the United States Supreme Court in that so-called DACA case that we all know, or should know. On June 13, 2020, in the Washington Post, they wrote several new studies published this month support wearing masks to curb the transmission of the novel coronavirus. The broadest, a review funded by the World Health Organization and published in the journal Lancet, concluded that data from 172 observational studies indicate face masks reduces the risk of coronavirus infection. That was on June 13th, 2020, 12 days after we had filed our case in the United States District Court in Richmond. And at least according to Cluck and Keeling at WJHL News 11, starting May 29th, Virginians must wear face coverings in an array of public places. So under the DACA rule for the nation's only physician serving as a state governor, doctor, before even getting into the findings in that observational, non-peer-reviewed, hastily completed study, can we use that evolving science under the law? No, we cannot. We cannot, because it is expressly excluded under that DACA case, doctor. And if you scan down 4 paragraphs below the exciting headline at the Washington Post that announced spate of new research supports wearing masks to control coronavirus spread, it actually states, our findings suggest, in multiple ways, that the use of masks is highly protective in healthcare and community settings, said the author of the review, Holger Schoenemann, an epidemiologist in position at McMaster University in Ontario. But that conclusion came with an important caveat. Screech! We have a low certainty in that, Schoenemann said, meaning that the authors cannot be strongly confident in that result. Oh, there's a ringing endorsement. Recognizing the shortcomings of the WHO study. Expressly in its own study, the Royal Society of London hastily put together their own study, which under the DACA case, again, rule would also be excluded. And that study had even been promoted by the New York Times as a new way of proving that non-medical grade facial coverings were effective, evolving science, using reproductive number metadata analysis, which has in the past been rejected as a measure of risk because of its vulnerability to manipulation by CDC, and that had, as we had discovered before, New York Times deleted their endorsement of that study, and which we let them know, relied upon the assumption that one-ply cotton was 98% impervious to microbial penetration. A little bit vulnerable to manipulation, metadata analysis, or superior to the N95 respirator, which is simply ludicrous. Okay, now some people are sitting there, you're trying to measure whether or not your mask works, and you're looking at where infections are coming up in states. Okay, there are a lot of things that can come up between states in terms of why there are infections. It's not because the mask, it's just not, that is not the way that you do it. You find out whether or not the damn mask works. New England Journal of Medicine, again after the facial coverings mandate, had a study for our visual learners, and perhaps you too watched the video and were completely convinced, because I personally saw multiple persons on the professional network of LinkedIn rejoicing and sharing in these after the buzzer research findings. And if you are convinced by a few nerds in the dark screaming the words healthy through their cloth coverings and running around happily doing their little experiments using laser lights to light up expelled droplets large enough to be seen by the unaided eye, hello, they can be seen, so they're being lit up and going through the dark. It is still violative of the rule articulated by the Supreme Court just last summer, and no study to date, regardless of the claims of evolving science, has yet to refute the conclusions of the NIOSH a decade ago, or we wouldn't be having these silly damn tests that have convinced you nonetheless. As the U.S. Supreme Court said in the 1987 case of U.S. v. Salerno, a facial challenge to a legislative act is, of course, the most difficult challenge to mount successfully, since the challenger must establish that no set of circumstances exist under which the act would be valid, and no set of circumstances exist that can retroactively apply evolving science to overturn the rule reiterated by the Supreme Court just last year in the, quote, DACA case. Moreover, no set of circumstances exist that might permit a regulation to be imposed in restriction of liberty that is not even reasonably calculated to prevent some intended harm, as stated by the Supreme Court in multiple cases on abortion, and which also required more than a general reference to public health. And while they may provide, as Governor Northam's own research suggests, feelings of empowerment and efficacy in times historically associated with confusion, fear, and despair, as the Supreme Court stated in West Virginia's State Board of Education v. Barnett in 1943, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be the orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein, and as stated in Stanley v. Georgia by that same court in 1969, whatever the power of the state to control public dissemination of ideas inimical to the public morality, it cannot constitutionally premise legislation on the desirability of controlling a person's private thoughts. And perhaps that is why a funny thing happened to our case on its way to the forum, which now finds that rather open and shut case before the justices of the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. Live long and prosper, Star Warriors. This briefing is unclassified. As you were, my name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
I used to be a Power Ranger in a former life.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.